And I would imagine some of those contrarians are like, oh, you don't need all that stuff. They're probably still using a lot of these tools for their own sanity, right? That person who's doing 60,000 releases a year or something, I guarantee they're automated out the wazoo. Like,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And when I do my own PRs, what do I write? Looks good to me.
Yeah, it looks good to me. It's great.
Hey everyone, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here as always by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey everybody.
Well, we are excited to be here today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes up top. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you're on any other platform, just leave a 5-star review or follow us. We love hearing from our listeners. And also, if you're on Twitter, follow us at Book Overflow Pod. I am particularly excited because the Twitter API finally supports sending tweets over 280 characters, which I pay $3 a month for the privilege. So the Book Overflow Pod Twitter account is automated now. I set up a simple little workflow just using SQS and Lambda and Event Bridge and AWS. It tweets out a quote from the books we're reading about every 2 hours now. So feel free to follow the account. It's just a good way to get some bite-sized knowledge throughout the day. We encourage you to read the whole book and to listen to the podcast, but that's a good way to kind of engage with some of the more specific ideas, because we can't cover everything in the episode, folks. So that's a great place to be. This is a funny little announcement, but I think it's fun. It's super weird, but I am a big theme park nerd. And we try not to mention on our discussion episodes the places we've worked. We just don't feel like it's super relevant. But if you've listened to the interview episodes, this has come out. I got my start working at Disney on a theme park software. Anyhow, and so I'm a big theme park fan. I've loved Disney for a long time, and I was actually able to be a guest on the podcast For Your Amusement, which is where every week they discuss in depth a theme park ride, and I chose. I contacted them, was able to choose the ride, and so we discussed Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run. So if you were interested in listening to me talk with 2 other folks for 2 hours about Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run, that's exactly the podcast for you. I understand there's probably very little overlap between the audiences here, but I thought I'd flag that for everyone. With that, I don't know, Nathan, are there any roughly personal announcements you want to make?
No, but I'm excited to see that. And I'd say there's at least a Poisson distribution where some set
there's someone.
Folks, yeah.
Who wants
cool.
to. Yeah. I love it. I found this podcast a while ago and it was like a podcast custom made for me. And so thank you everyone for listening to Book Overflow, because it gave me the credibility I needed I messaged them. And I think my real selling point was I was a former Disney park software engineer. And so the Millennium Falcon ride is probably the most technically advanced ride in terms of software that Disney parks has. Anyhow, but the Book Overflow podcast gave me the credibility to say I'm not just some random guy. I have a somewhat successful podcast, and I'd like to be on yours too.
That's awesome.
Thanks everyone for tuning in and letting me do that.
That's so cool. That's so cool.
Yeah,
Hopefully we do a lot more stuff where we get to go out and talk to other podcasters about things we're interested in. That's really, really fun.
Yeah, and we have some crossover stuff in the works. We already talked with Scott Talinsky of Syntax. We have some other influencers we're currently in talks with, and hopefully we'll have some episodes for you soon. And we have some other really, really cool stuff working through the pipeline that'll happen here on Book Overflow. So one is already recorded, and we're very excited to release it. And the other thing we're probably the most excited about is scheduled, and we are in active discussion with all of the participants, and that's the only hint I'll give you. Participants plural. So some new stuff coming to the podcast, but we think you're going to like it. With all that, let's talk about the book this week. This is a special week for Book Overflow. This is where we read Looks Good to Me by Adrienne Braganza, but this is special for a couple reasons. One, this book was recommended to us by the author herself, Adrienne Braganza. We're going to talk about her in just a bit. But it is an early access preview. If you subscribe to Manning, you can get it through the Manning Early Access program. And if you're like us, you can just get a PDF emailed to you from the author, which was pretty neat. So let's talk a bit about who Adrienne Braganza and kind of her background. This is her description. A Filipina software engineer who traded scrubs for code, Adrienne Braganza is the best-selling author of Coding for Kids, Python, an international speaker, and a LinkedIn learning instructor reaching tens of thousands of students. Her curiosity and knack for deciphering developer concepts has taken her to tech conferences worldwide. When not crafting code or captivating audience, she's exploring new cultures and cuisine with her husband, indulging in coffee and pastries, or losing herself in strategies, the best of which is Age of Empires 2, according to her. Now, this is a smart lady. She knows her real-time strategy games. You ever play Age of Empires 2, Nathan?
No, I'm in like, I think I was really into Red Alert, like Command and Conquer series.
Oh, I love Command and Conquer.
But I appreciated folks who got into that. By the time I really those games were out, I had moved on to other stuff. But it's pretty cool looking.
I am a connoisseur of all real-time strategy games, and it's sad it's a little dead as a genre. My son and I, who is 6 years old, were playing Warcraft 3 together the other night.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So, Adrienne, a bit of a different author than who we usually read. Usually we read people who are very, very well established in the industry. We're talking our Brian Kernighan's, Uncle Bob's, John Ousterhout's, right? But I've really been enjoying this book so far. This podcast focused just on the first half of Looks Good to Me. We read chapters 1 through 5. And we'll give you just a quick introduction on the book. This is its Amazon blurb. Looks Good to Me offers a unique approach to delivering meaningful code reviews that goes beyond superficial checklists and tense critical conversations. Instead, you'll learn how to improve both your applications and your team dynamics. And I just want to say, this is my favorite title of any book we've ever read. Yep. Looks Good to Me, I think, is a fantastic title for a book on code reviews. Nathan, why don't you give us your general thoughts on the book?
Yeah, I love the title of this book as well. And I remember the first time I ever saw an LGTM written in a code review, I was like, what is this? And I tried to like decipher it myself, and it was just funny. And then I was like, oh, okay. And it was like, one of our principal software engineers who actually wrote it. And I was like, okay, this must be like a thing. And so I just remember having that first experience. Obviously, don't always want that as your feedback, but sometimes it's great. And so I thought it was a really fun and playful book. I will say this is also, I think, the first book that we have that has emojis in the book, which is also fun. So it's I think my thoughts on this book is that this is really a focus, at least in the first half, on how teams do code reviews, right? It's not a technical deep dive into, what makes a good computer science code review on the inner workings of a function or something. This is much more on how does a team do it? How do reviewers do it? And I think that's cool. I think it's the right level for most people who are trying to get into this world of how do I do a proper code review, right? It's a great question to ask. It's very approachable. I loved the tone of it. It was really easy to read, which again, I think maybe this comes from her background in public speaking and in doing a lot of instructional and community work. You can tell there's a lot of empathy for the reader. Also, I think I like the balance. We've talked about this in other books, the balance between going over principles and then giving examples. And it's examples plural, which I really appreciate, because sometimes, you'll see, here's a concrete example and then here's the principle. But I really love it when it's like, here's a principle and here's example 1, here's example 2, and here's example 3, where I go over the edge cases, or I'm like, oh, in this case, it's like this. I like that. That's how my brain works. And so it helps me sort of like play with the idea a little bit, and it gave me a deeper appreciation. And like I said, it's a real focus on like pro-social behavior. You kind of take a frame of reference of like, oh, I'm the author, I'm the reviewer, I'm a leader. Here's what my approach should be, or here's how I encourage folks to adopt the system. And again, I'm a big fan so far. I'm optimistic that the second half of the book is going to be in a very similar vein. What about you?
No, absolutely. This book is interesting because generally on this podcast, we try to target books with a pretty long shelf life, right? And so, we've had even some authors come to us and say, hey, I just wrote like, Azure, working in Azure and C# or whatever. And it's like, that sounds really interesting. But we're trying to keep things or do things with a really long shelf life and that are pretty broad and that all of our listeners can enjoy. So we tend to read a lot of broad reading. And this book is different in that it's probably the most narrow reading we've done, but not in a bad way, just because it's all completely focused on one subject. You can compare it to something like Clean Coder, which is about like professionalism in general, building evolutionary architectures, which is, all about the art of evolving your software architecture. I mean, something as broad as a philosophy of software design, right, which touches everything, 18 different aspects of software design, right? This is all about code reviews. So it's been fun to read something that's a little more narrow and specific. But that's not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. So it's just very dedicated to its subject matter. And this is kind of what I love about the podcast is we get to find out someone is interested enough in code reviews that they wrote a 450-page book about it, which like is insane to me. But again, not in a bad way. Like, I think it's like, we started this podcast with me saying that I just did another podcast where I talked about the Millennium Falcon ride for 2 hours, right? Like, I love learning about people's very niche interests. And so to find out that this is what someone is so passionate about is code reviews is really, really cool. Like Nathan said, very easy read. She's got a breezy writing style in the best way possible. Very approachable. I think you put it perfectly, Nathan. A lot of empathy for the reader. And yeah, I mean, it's as much a book, at least in the first half, about communication as it is about code reviews, which I really appreciate. And I think code reviews are an interesting mechanism. We'll talk about this later in the episode, I imagine. As someone who has been working remote since the pandemic and at this point is pretty bought in on it, I find one of the things with remote work as opposed to in-person work is that you need to formalize a lot of informal interactions. And code reviews, I think, are one of the places where a lot of that formalization can take place. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting thoughts about just communicating and effective teams. And she even breaks down at different points, like the differences between like in-office teams versus remote teams and how each might, address a code review in a different way. Just this book is comprehensive in the best way possible. Nathan, any thoughts before we take a quick break?
No, I'm ready to dive right in.
Well, fantastic. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll be right back with more of our discussion of the first half of Looks Good to Me. And we are back. Thanks so much for being a listener. Well, like we say with this podcast, it's a book club podcast, not a book report podcast. So some books we feel like we got to go chapter by chapter just to really, even just to kind of focus our thoughts. So we did that with our Building Evolutionary Architecture episodes, just because there was so much good stuff in there. And it was a very, very dense book. Other books we feel like, we pick and choose the best parts and just want to talk about those. So, we're going to start off with kind of a high level discussion of code reviews, which is really what this book is about. Her mission statement in the book, this is her quote. She says, "I want you to experience code reviews the way they can be: effective, empathetic, and effortless for your team." Nathan, I mean, what's your relationship with code reviews in your career thus far?
Yeah, it's one of those things where like everybody knows they need to do them as soon as you are writing code as a team. I think the book here really brings up a really good point, which is that you have a code review process, whether you've designed a code review process or not, right? And that it's much better to be deliberate and explicit in what those expectations are than have it be implicit, because otherwise it just kind of is amorphous and expectations can be mismatched. Frustrations can bubble up, right? Because this is an inflection point where humans are asking other humans to get involved in an otherwise automated process, right? And there can be misunderstanding, right? I think I've had really great code review processes and teams that like really cherish excellence around, operational excellence in engineering. And I've also been in places where it was basically just a rubber stamp machine, where it was considered like kind of an inconvenience and everybody would like fly fast and loose and not really do a code review. And so it was this sort of like, yeah, we do code reviews, but it wasn't really, right? It was really just sort of like oh, there's a blame trail if two people signed off on something and, bugs go to production. So what about you? What about your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've always worked at places with code reviews. It's one of the things that, again, I like reading these books because you get a glimpse into how some other people operate. It just never occurred to me that you wouldn't do a code review. But I agree on the look, sometimes there's a rubber stamp. Sometimes you want that rubber stamp, right? You should. But I've definitely been in the position where I've worked a long time on a feature and maybe I'm even running a bit behind and it's finally done and I just need to get it across the finish line. And you're like, oh gosh, please don't find anything in the code review. It's one thing I've really liked about reading this book is just trying to reorient my thinking about what a code review can be, right? Because the code reviews, I'm totally blanking here. I need more sleep last night. Marshmallow. Yeah, it reorients my thinking about what a code review can be. Because if the code review is just the thing you have to do before the code gets into the code base and starts moving along to production, then you might just want the rubber stamp. But if you think about code reviews in the way she talks about in this book, they can be a real knowledge sharing opportunity. I think she talks. I don't know. What do you think about that, Nathan? About code reviews as kind of like a knowledge sharing opportunity as opposed to just a final check before it enters the code base.
Yeah. Later, like I guess more towards the middle of the book, she talks about how this can really cultivate everything from engaging with the domain expert, right? Let's say you're changing a part of the code, and so there's very specific requests that you need. It's a great way to engage for you to learn, like, am I doing this correctly? Let me reach out to the person who maybe like built the checkout service or something, and let them review and see how they engage. The other one is I really liked it was like a complete flip, which is get a junior dev or get somebody who's brand new to the team to be an observer, right? Like get them to watch the code review process. So not only do they learn about the code base, they get to see you interact with the, principal or senior level person who maybe worked on it, and it gives them an opportunity. Maybe they find something themselves, right? It gives them an opportunity to contribute and set expectations on what goes there. One of the things I thought was kind of cool, I didn't know any, I always love it, and we pick these up a lot, the histories. I didn't realize that there's like, you can pinpoint the history of when this code review process was sort of formalized. And it was from an IBM researcher in 1976. So it's really funny that we're having this like debate, and that over the last probably 15 years, especially during all of the accelerations and tooling to make it a lot easier to do these processes, we've come a long way. But this guy Michael Fagan identified this back in 1976 and said that a formal code inspection process was necessary, is how he referred to it. And I think one of the quotes was, designed in code inspections to reduce errors in program development, right? So you need this sort of formal design phase, formal code inspection phase, to make sure that what you're writing is actually correct and it's checked by other people. Such a powerful idea, and it took a long time. I would imagine he felt like an island.
Yeah.
But a lot of people were, especially if you read like some of Uncle Bob's like early day stuff, like they weren't doing that. They were just writing crazy code. So yeah.
He's like the doctor who discovered that washing hands was critical and went like insane because no one believed him. This was probably this guy for the 25 years. Well, Uncle Bob was slinging code,
right? And me too, right? Like, and again, that's interesting because you've been in formal review process environments where they've got these mature things in place. It adds so much structure, and I don't think people realize how much tech debt a failure to have proper processes introduces, because you're not measuring anything. You don't have expectations set properly, and unless leadership and the teams hold themselves to this higher standard, if it doesn't exist, that's where this book's really interesting. It's like this now gives you a vocabulary and a language to talk about what might be missing, right? And I think that's super powerful. It's one of the things I really appreciated about this book.
I've on Twitter recently, there's been a bit of a hubbub. Just some cowboy coder devs. I mean, they're making real products, but I won't name names, but some somewhat notable Twitter personalities just kind of very much poo-pooing process and saying, you don't need any of these fancy frameworks. You don't need any cloud technology. You don't need anyone. I do 60,000 commits each year, and I'm just shipping code to production. I'm like, well, that's fine for you. You're one guy, and you can put out just tons and tons of stuff. But most of us work in teams. Most of us work at medium to big companies, and I am sometimes reflexively contrarian in defense of the status quo, if that makes any sense. It's like I say, like I'm anti jargon. Like people, I think sometimes people try to pass it off as like sophisticated. That someone says like, "Oh, you said circle back." Like I'm going to circle back to this, and that's a dumb way of talking. And it's like I don't know. Sometimes jargon actually communicates a relatively unique concept in our industry fairly quickly. And so I'm not saying like there's a lot of jargon that does sound kind of funny, but I think people try to pass it off as like a sophisticated or intelligent take just to kind of reflexively shoot down any jargon. And I'm seeing that with things like cloud technologies like AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, where people are saying a little like, you don't need any of this stuff. I'm like, I don't know. It solves a problem. It solves a big problem for a lot of people. And in some ways, especially if you can do it in like a limited way, it makes a lot of sense. I was feeling particularly defensive because I just spent about 90 minutes automating the Book Overflow Twitter account. And I used, it's a combination of, it uses S3, Lambda, SQS, and Event Bridge. All, very, very small components each, but the combination of all of them makes a pretty easy to manage Twitter account. And could I have done this using just a text file? I even debated just standing up on, loading Linux onto my Raspberry Pi and standing up an application there. But there are a lot of reasons where I decided not to do that. I wanted to be able to get new quotes into the account as fast as I could. I wanted to have some way to kind of monitor errors if it ever quit tweeting out quotes. Anyhow, it was a bit of a tangent. But all of that to say that I think there are some people who kind of take a badge of honor in not having any sort of process. And a lot of times you just need process. And I'm a big fan of code reviews. I just think there are very few scenarios where you can defend not having them. Like you said, Nathan, you're going to accumulate tech debt without them.
Right. Well,
yeah,
it's an operational risk to the business if you don't have them. And the reason being is, and she talks about this in the book. It's the, I think she called it the section was like the bus factor. I've always talked about either getting hit by a bus or what if you win the lottery and you quit your job tomorrow, right? I used to say get hit by the bus all the time, and I had a manager who's like, I'd like to think that you just won the lottery. That's why you're not here anymore. And
she calls it the vacation factor.
Yes, vacation factor. That's it. So the idea of his is that, and we see this, right? This is against the hero mode piece. I think this is a larger idea, which is it feels good to swoop in and be the one person that could do stuff. But for an organization, it's dysfunctional. And it's a huge risk because all of a sudden, if you have some unique hidden knowledge or if you have some process that's not documented somewhere, having repeatable processes that anyone can step in and do doesn't mean that you're replaceable. It just means that the organization has reduced the risk. It's like the N+1 problem, right? I need something highly available, so therefore I need to write a server so that any N number of instances can run in parallel, right? That's my de-risking. So if an individual EC2 instance at AWS goes down, there's no magical server that's running some special part of our business. The same thing is important for the code review process, is that if you care about the quality, and again, I think what's kind of cool is there's this whole section in the book. A lot of it is about the human-led portions. But then in the final chapter that we read for this part, in chapter 5, the whole thing is about automations. The whole thing is about, hey, if you make everything human-led and everything manual and everybody's having to check everything, that's no fun. Nobody wants to go in and be like, oh, you use spaces and not tabs here, or like, oh, we put the curly bracket at the end of the function, not on the next line. You automate those things away, right? We have linters, we have static analysis tools, we have all these things. You absolutely should modify those. And not only that, if you're a single dev shop, you should use those tools too. The automations still apply. Let robots be your peer, your code reviewers, right? Get as many early signals as you can that maybe you're not meeting your own standards. That's super important. It doesn't have to be humans that are doing it. And honestly, the best teams I've seen, and I'm sure this is the true in your environment, we have all these what we call quality gates, right? Quality gate is anything in your CI/CD process that gives extra insight at the time of code review, and it could also quality gate the blocking of merging a PR, to your trunk or whatever. But that's that extra insight, like, oh, they passed all their tests. Oh, it's got 80% test coverage. Oh, static analysis says there's no code smells, right? Like when I'm doing a code review, I want all that extra insight. And even on projects that I do by myself, I still try to do a PR. Even if I'm approving it myself, because I'm the only person who could approve it, I still do a PR to make sure that the stuff built, that the test passed, that the really basic stuff that is, and I would imagine some of those contrarians are like, oh, you don't need all that stuff. They're probably still using a lot of these tools for their own sanity, right? That person who's doing 60,000 releases a year or something, I guarantee they're automated out the wazoo. Like,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And when I do my own PRs, what do I write? Looks good to me.
Yeah, it looks good. It's great.
Well, yeah, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more discussion on the book. We're going to get into some of the places we've worked at and the code review culture there. We've talked a bit about that. We're going to talk about what makes a good code review, our thoughts on code reviews in general. There's a lot to talk about code reviews, folks. There's a whole 450-page book on it, which we are reading. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back. And we are back. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so we start out with a bit of a high-level discussion of code reviews. And we want to talk a bit more now about what actually goes into a good code review. And not even just how you can approach a code review, when you get one to review yourself, but even like what kind of automation can you set up around your code reviews to make them a simple, smooth process. Nathan, chapter 3 covers a lot of this, and really the whole book actually, but what are some of the things that have stood out to you in the first half of this book about making an effective code review process? What are maybe some of the tools or strategies you've used in your career that you found really effective? What are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, there's so many good things, right? So the book kind of goes through and it covers, here's these roles, right? And they talk about like the reviewer, the author, the team, leadership, like how they play these different parts. A big theme that keeps coming up is leave your ego at the door, right? It's this really important concept. It sounds very basic, but it's really easy, especially if you're a little apprehensive or if maybe you're working on something that's been kind of frustrating. Um, you know, it's not common, and most of the folks I work with are very reasonable. But every once in a while, there's a little holy war or nitpicks that just get under people's skin, and you just always have to remind yourself of like how to approach that. I think a big thing that I liked though, once they got past sort of expectations of the roles, and the book really dives into it in a really nice way. They there's focus on building the code review process and doing things like setting expectations. Like every team's different, right? Some teams are going to need to be super maintainability and stability focused, like hyper vigilant about it in every code review. Some of them are going to be, they even talked about this debate on should you try to detect bugs in the code review. I thought that was interesting because there's some academic papers that she references that are like, oh, you shouldn't. It's actually like not a good use of your time. And then there's some contrarian views here, and says like, in contrast, many maintain that finding bugs is a feasible goal and should happen within the review process. Some studies and many developers cite finding bugs as a big benefit of code reviews. And so I think that like the focus here is there is no one size fits all, right? The industry that you're in, the culture that you're in, using the code review process to shore up your weaknesses, right? Maybe you're a super genius when it comes to security thinking, right? And that isn't something that really needs to get the closest scrutiny by another human. Maybe we have a bunch of automated tools, or maybe you're just a domain expert. I'm not saying don't think about security. That would be bad, but maybe the team's expressed goal of like, what do we do? What is our expectation that when you spend, the 1 hour or whatever, really diving into this code review? And so, yeah, it really ties into these guidelines of, you know, what these focuses should be, and also setting expectations on things like what blocks a PR. Like, can I read through it, and then my feedback blocks you? You have to address my feedback directly before, or you have to get two people to do the review before, right? Like, setting these expectations is really interesting. Or what is the emergency case in which we do allow self-approved PRs, right? I loved the exploration of like refining this process as a team. Was there anything that stuck out to you?
Several things. Yeah, I wanted to talk about kind of a couple of the stuff you brought up. Um, I guess we can talk more generally about ego. She says, to start, you leave your ego out of the review. Forget about job titles, internal squabbles, and personality traits. Those shouldn't matter when you review someone's code. Focus on the code and not much else. Let the code as presented to you in the PR dictate your understanding, the judgments you form, and the conclusions you make. So I really like the separation out of, like you said, ignore title, ignore your ego, just focus on the code. And that kind of separating the code out from the individual, it's a two-way street, because not only does it mean that you should judge the code you're reviewing purely on the quality of the code and not who wrote it, but it also means that, and she says this elsewhere in the book, you are not your code. And I don't know, Nathan, is this something you've ever struggled with or seen someone struggle with, having a really strong attachment to the code they wrote and not being able to quite separate out criticism of it from criticism of themselves?
Yeah. I once worked with a guy who, I think some programmers are very structured, and so they'll like it's like they're writing a symphony, right? They think about what the violin will do when it comes in its part, and the oboe and the timpani and all these pieces, and they've really thought about it, and then they write their code. And then some software engineers are more like jazz musicians, where they kind of like, they know the chord progression that they're going to be dealing with. They're just kind of like, they're riffing. And I've seen both code styles work. But where I had one engineer we were working with who was on the jazz musician side and kind of painted himself into a corner with an implementation. It technically worked, but it was a strange style, and it was one that I had concerns over maintainability. Specifically, I brought up like several areas in which I thought the abstraction was wrong. And he took it very personally. And I was not intending it to be personal. I was like, hey, there's these patterns that we can abstract it out like this. I think you're going to need to restructure it. It was the most like thorough feedback I'd ever been of like, this should be thrown out, right? Like this is an implementation that should be thrown out. I ended up losing that argument and was overridden by the CTO saying that we don't have time to do this. Like that, basically, like what I was saying was an ivory tower thing, and we didn't have time to do it that way. And I'm not joking. I wish I was wrong. I wish it was me being like catastrophizing. 6 months later, when we're like in the depths of doing some QA, they found all these edge cases, and the team finally admitted, oh, that abstraction would have been really useful for this. Like it would have been easier to test each one. It was a very like procedural, like a state machine type thing that was going on. And I wish I had stood my ground, right? Like I wish we'd had a proper process in place. I wish that we had these things, but again, it came down to the fact that this guy was it was very personal to him. Like I was attacking him as a programmer, which I wasn't. I mean, I think all of us can have, again, it's the design it twice piece, right? We should design it twice. We should poke holes in it. We should say, okay, is this actually the right implementation? And yeah, I've always kept that with me on like, could I have de-escalated earlier? Could we have set expectations that if we talk about the code, it's not a personal attack? That would have been a really nice thing to have in like a Confluence document or something. Have you had any experiences around that?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I really like what you said about, comparing different programmers, like different forms of musicians. I'm more like a bucket drummer or like a soulful hobo with a harmonica. That's kind of where I would put myself as far as coding goes. um, but just you talking about, yeah, people who take it really personally. One of my favorite type of like board games or party games is like, I don't know what they're called, like social deduction type games, like Mafia or Werewolf or Secret Hitler. I love that. And I've got a buddy. I mentioned him on the podcast before. He's also named Nathan. But yeah, we've known each other since our first grade, and we go way back. We love playing these sorts of games together because we'll just be at each other's throats the entire time, screaming at each other. And then it'll end, and we'll find out like we were on opposite sides, and then we'll yell at everyone else for not believing one of us, or we'll find out we were on the same side, and then we'll yell at each other for being suspicious. But it's a lot of fun. And then it ends, and I'm just like, that was great. And then it's on with the next thing, right? I've always been able to kind of separate myself out from those situations. Like we're playing a game, right? But I have played those games with some people that can't quite separate it out, and they get really upset if you like accuse them of being the werewolf or something like that, and then you kind of back off because you're like, I'm pretty sure this person is the werewolf, but it's not worth risking a friendship over. And then the worst is if they are the werewolf or whatever, and then they win and they'll gloat like, "Ha ha, I had you all fooled." I'm like, you didn't have me fooled. You were just really mean, and so I didn't want to push the envelope here. But just you talking about that situation with your coworker, where it's like you knew, and you felt that this was the right call to make, and you wish you had stood your ground. What do you do when they start to get a little hostile and aggressive, and you're worried about ruining the relationship? I've been in situations like that before. I remember shadowing someone. This wasn't a code review; it was an interview, and this was someone who I've been worked with. And we had a bit of I could tell the relationship was a little testy. I could tell that this person, um, some of the assignments I'd gotten, I think I had gotten some of the projects and responsibilities that this person had wanted. And I could tell that they were a little bitter about it. And so then I'm assigned to kind of shadow them during an interview, and I'm watching the way they interview. And I was like, I was not impressed with how they interviewed. And part of what I thought my responsibility might be was to kind of tell them, hey, I feel like maybe you should have done this or this differently. But it was also another thing where I was like, I feel like I don't have a lot of social capital with this person to begin with. I don't know if I want to use it up on something as like trivial, not trivial, but as fleeting. And in terms of interviewing, right? That's 5% of our job. Why use up social capital on this? It was a tricky situation to manage. I think it speaks to the idea, and Adrienne in her book talks about it too, of emotional and psychological safety in a team, where you feel like you have the license to provide constructive criticism. We talk about this several times on the podcast, the idea of the blameless postmortem, that when something goes wrong, it's not a lot of finger pointing. You gotta have a healthy team culture around that. Code reviews are just one part of having that healthy team culture. Um, I love one of the quotes. I don't have it on me, but she quotes someone else who basically says that programmers are more willing to be yelled at by a robot than a human. And so she advocates for automation. That can be one way that you can kind of maintain your social capital on a team, is to automate parts of the code review process. Nathan, do you have any thoughts about a successful code review automation you've seen, or maintaining social capital in general?
Yeah. Again, I think part of this responsibility falls on leadership. And I think honestly, with that other story that I had, that was really a failure in leadership. In that the leader should have seen that me and this other person were struggling. I actually went to the leader and talked to him, and he basically was like, "Oh, well, you're an architect." I was a cloud architect, and so I was like, "You're an architect, and they're software engineers, so like, you know, they're going to own this implementation, so that we should just stop right there." And I was just kind of like surprised, because I'm from this culture of I don't care if you're junior or super senior. If you point something out, we should take it seriously. And I've worked on other engineering teams where that was true. Um, I think that it really comes down to this contract, and she actually brings up this idea of a team working agreement, right? And it would be on two sides. If we made a team working agreement and it said, if there's a dispute and the architect and the software engineer don't agree, the software engineer wins. Well, I just need to shut up at that point, right? Like that would be our team working agreement. I would argue that that's dysfunctional, but at least it wouldn't be ambiguous, right? I wouldn't be frustrated with the process, which I was, because there was ambiguity there. And of course, it also shut me down when it came to other times that I was weighing in, right? It was very much like an organizational thing where they say like stay in your lane. Um, and to me, again, I think that's a big red flag. I think that you know, but again, the team working agreement is that I'd never thought about making a formal document for a team working agreement. Do you have a team working agreement at your current company?
No, we do not have a team working agreement. It is something I've thought about, though. Again, this is one of the things that I think is even more important when you work on like an all remote or a digitally distributed team,
Mm-hmm.
because some kind of like some social practices you can kind of like synthesize out of the air and absorb via osmosis just by being in a room with the same people for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's harder when you work remote. And so I think kind of formalizing some of those expectations into a team working agreement is a really good decision. This actually reminded me a lot of what they talk about, what Mark Richards and Neal Ford talk about in Fundamentals of Software Architecture, the idea of like the architectural design record, the ADRs, that basically once you make a decision, write it down, talk about
Right.
why the decision was made, and then if someone wants to reapproach that decision in the future, you can just say, no, we already made this decision, right? That's how I feel about the team working agreement too, that there's a lot of value in, after some knowledge has been decided by the team, writing that down somewhere and saying, hey, do you remember the last time we had this code review? And, like in your example, Nathan, and, the cloud architect and the software engineer disagreed, but we let the software engineer win because he's the software engineer. And then it wound up being a big issue. Well, according to this, so we're going to rework the team working agreement to just clarify that everyone is an equal stakeholder in the code and has license to criticize implementations. I think, and I think when you hear about a team working agreement, you might think, oh gosh, another meeting where we all sit down and decide everything that we agree on together. Like that sounds awkward. That doesn't sound like it's going to work. And I agree that approach might not. But Adrienne doesn't talk about a team working agreement as this thing that's set in stone, never to change. She talks about it as like a living document. And
Yeah.
you might find that a team working agreement is written line by line, just as you gain knowledge as a team.
Yep. It reminds me of like codes of conduct and these other things where I think that they're a basic version of them are really nice and they can completely go overboard, right? Actually, I just read Animal Farm to my daughter, and it really kind of points out the whole like insanity that bureaucracies can be, right? People can they can weaponize a bureaucracy. And I do think that any sort of binding agreement across a group of people, especially if it's managed in a very like bureaucratic way, can actually be a tool of oppression. And I think people who've been burned by that in the past probably tense up a little bit when you're like, oh boy, we can't make decisions anymore. I have to go read the manual, But if you keep it democratic, if you keep it so that the team actually owns the document, it's not being dictated down, right? This isn't Snowball from Animal Farm telling everyone what you have to do. It's actually like the animals themselves making this working agreement. I think it's wonderful. And I've been in environments in which we did set expectations like this and we were very document oriented. Like, hey, somebody could dispute a line item in it and be like, I don't think this is serving us well. Here's why. Here's the difficulty that I had. I think we should amend it this way. And the team voted and amended the document. And it was the most healthy way of doing it. Because then you go, hey, we voted on this. Like, this is the new process. We got to do it this way, right? This is the whole point is that Nitpicks shouldn't be blocking, right? Like, oh, you don't like the way something was named because I didn't do a certain thing. We should take note of this. Maybe put this in our backlog to fix naming, but you're not blocking my PR, right? Like that's like, and the team might agree to that. Or you might be an organization where names are incredibly important. You've been burned by bad names in the past, and that nitpick, in your team is not a nitpick. It is a crucial thing. Because you maybe use connaissance of naming and you really care about naming, right? And so again, I love this idea. I Yeah, we'll talk about it more later. I think this is one of the things that I think would be really useful to experiment with. Um,
No,
yeah,
absolutely. So you just mentioned connaissance, and that is one of those topics that, as we were reading the book, I'm like, yeah, connaissance, I'll, whatever, come back to it. And I don't know, it's just been bouncing around in my head all the time. Connaissance, folks, very interesting topic. Read
living
about
rent free. Yeah.
Well, why don't we go ahead and take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about team dynamics, how you can work as a team, and how code reviews factor into that. And we are back. Thank you for listening, everyone. Well, let's talk a bit about, like we said, everyone prefers being yelled at by a robot as opposed to a person. So one of the ways you can have robots yell at you, if you're into that sort of stuff, is by using automation in your code reviews. Lots of great tools to kind of automate standards and enforcement when it comes to doing code reviews. Nathan, any tools you like or have used in the past?
Yes, this one was interesting because I think the de facto set of tools that most people are using these days is something like GitHub or GitLab. Um, but there's other tools out there, right? So like GitHub and GitLab are obviously the most common code repositories, but not everyone uses the PR code review patterns out of those. And I was in a startup, so the one and only Silicon Valley based startup I was involved with. They used a tool called Fabricator, and I had never heard of Fabricator. I thought it was so strange. Like we hosted our code on GitHub, but it was tied into this like external collaboration and code review tool because it had a few features that just didn't exist in GitHub. At least at the time that they had implemented it, it didn't exist. And this was changing, but it was like an alternate universe because it had its own quirks and bugs. And so a quick little story about Fabricator. Apparently, it was an internal tool written at Facebook. And so Facebook had written this tool, and then the guy who had written it ended up making like an open source implementation that went out to the public, and it became his like, I think he was working like it was like there was like a commercial implementation or something that he was like trying to work on it full time, and then while I was there, um, it stopped being commercially supported. I think it was in 2021. It stopped operations and no longer was being maintained and got handed over to like a community. I think it got renamed to like Forge or something like this with a PH. Um, what was interesting is like I came in SRE and was like, hey, we should move to GitHub and not have a server that could go down and crash and do all these other things. And it was like a mutiny happened because there was a few power users in the organization that were like, this would break how we do code reviews. And I walked away with a ton of empathy. And so there are teams. There's other tools like Garrett. There's other like tools for code review that have workflows that just are not comparable, but give you like a lot of interesting feedback. And I was just wondering, like, what has your experience been? Have you always leaned on the big tools, or have y'all had custom in-house things?
I hate custom in-house things with a passion. Um, I've made that clear many times. I'm a really like boring by the books developer. Like I'm just
Right.
like, what's the most popular open source framework? What's the most popular platform? That's what we're gonna go with. I am mad that we are on Google Cloud as opposed to AWS at my job. That's how by the books I am.
That's so funny.
So, no, I've always just kind of used GitHub. I mean, at the cloud provider I worked at, like we had a lot of homegrown internal tooling. Some of it had nice features, right? One thing I liked about their kind of custom implementation of Git was that if you were working on multiple repos, you could make a code review that that had all of them together. Is that something you can do in GitHub? I don't believe. Can you make a pull request that has multiple repos?
Ooh, I don't
I
think
don't
so.
think you can.
There's third-party tools that can, like, we've definitely done. I've worked in environments where we have like stacked commits where it'll make sure it basically puts them in a commit queue and does some other special things so you don't run into these like race conditions of PRs that are being pushed in at the same time. But no, I don't. And I think this is exactly the thing is like there's certain more advanced workflows that just aren't appropriate. GitHub product management, it goes, okay, what are 99% of engineers focused in? And then if you have some like corporate, workflow that has to happen, that's where you start reaching for these supplemental tools. And, again, Fabricator worked with GitHub. It's just we didn't do code reviews in GitHub, right? The code review happened. And it did do some kind of interesting things. Like when you gave feedback, you could have a nitpick or give feedback, and then you could look at the commit from when you opened the thing to where you did the feedback and the diff inside of that. So it was kind of interesting when you go like, okay, here's where you addressed my feedback, the commit for that, and then here's where you opened it, and I could see the code change just from the one feedback piece, which is more granular than you typically see in a GitHub. You can actually do it with GitHub now, but at the time, it wasn't easy to see what the intermediate commit, the diff between the intermediate commits inside of a code review was. And even the way that they presented it was easier to see. And I appreciate that. Like, again, I didn't think it was worth using Fabricator in its total, but I did go, oh yeah, that's kind of cool. Like that's a neat thing. And I know Garrett does something like that too. It's like it has multiple workflows and stuff.
Here's our business idea, Nathan. When this podcast fizzles out, this is what we're going to do. It's like Elon Musk. He believes that all input with a car is poor design. So like he doesn't like that you have to do a turn signal, right? Because he thinks that the car should just know that you're going to turn and should do it for you. I say we take that same philosophy with code reviews, and instead we make everyone wear like lie detector. Like, you hook them up to like a lie detector almost, like you monitor their heart rate and things like that. And then we just track where their eyes are on the code. And then we get the authentic reaction that the person has to the code. They look at a line, makes them mad. We give that information back to the designer. And then the
LGTM credibility score, which is like, did you actually look at any of this code?
This isn't a dystopian nightmare at all.
Yeah. No. What could go wrong?
I've seen places that kind of get too married to that kind of internal tooling. Again, the cloud provider I worked at was like everything was internal tooling, and so it was just kind of like the water you swam in there. Right. But I also think something I've really come to appreciate as I've advanced in my career is the benefit to just tugging on threads a little tighter or a little more than you might initially want to. And what do I mean by that? For example, I was working with Kafka the other day.
Yep.
Kafka, it's like a distributed message queue type system. You subscribe to topics and you can read from those topics. I was basically, we had an Apache Beam pipeline that read from a Kafka topic, translated it, basically transformed the input and then outputted it to a different Kafka topic. And so I was running that locally. Just trying to do a very simple transformation, but it was my first time kind of working with this pipeline and getting Kafka set up and running locally in that particular way. And I was having a lot of trouble replicating this transformation process, and ultimately figured out that Kafka has a very smart, it's designed very intelligently, where once you consume a message, Kafka has like this, I think they call it like offset committing, where basically you commit to the Kafka broker that served you up these messages. You basically tell it what the last message you received was. And then That way it knows that when you come back to read more messages, it won't give you those messages again, right? But this is tricky if you're trying to make a lot of changes to the pipeline and run it over and over and over again. I would just start up the pipeline and it wouldn't consume the messages. I'm like, what the freak is going on here? And so after a bit of research, I found out about that offset committing. And I found out that if I wanted to retest with the same input, I either needed to seed the topic again with that input, or I needed to purge the topic and then reseed it completely with the same input. But that was just an area where I think in the past I would have been like, oh, that's weird. For some reason, I need to purge the topic to get it to run again. Oh, well, at least I know how to test it. But instead, I started thinking like, why is that? And yeah, I read up about that offset committing, and then I put a note in our documentation with the purge command and just a quick explanation of what offset committing is, and a link to the Kafka documentation describing it. Just because now, hopefully, future developers don't have to deal with that as much. And so I think, yeah, there's value in just tugging on threads a little more. And so when you talk about like automation, I think the less experienced engineers wind up doing things where you think, oh, automation would be really great if we could make sure that everyone's using curly braces the same way, right? But you might not even know that there's an idea out there called linting that already does that, right? And I think because we're engineers, we're so gung-ho to build things, you might write a script, really quickly. This validates that we're all using curly braces the same way. What I'm saying is just tug on that thread a little tighter, try to do some research on your own, and you'll find out that there's like a lot of open source tooling to solve that problem for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of standards-based approaches, and I'll push back. If somebody is recommending doing a custom implementation of something, I go, show me that this doesn't exist in a general form, right? Like, show me that we're solving this problem in such a novel way that we have to do this, right? I'm the same, but I'm a huge fan of conventional commits. Do y'all use conventional commits at your
What do you mean
company?
by that?
Oh, cool. So yeah, this is like, this is one of the few things that I'm evangelical about. Conventional commits is it's a machine readable way to write commits to titles to your PRs and your commits that it's machine readable, but it also like gives a scope and a focus, and it can imply you can use conventional commits to parse semantic versioning. So your commit will say this is patch level through the syntax. This is patch level. This can be ignored by the semantic versioning solver. This is a feature, or this is a breaking change, and it signals to the whole build system that something is happening. And so a common one is you do feat, like FEAT, like short for feature, feat : added sales tax to the checkout process or whatever, right? Like some meaningful title. Feat meaning that it's a feature, and you can also give it a scope. So it could be like feature feat, and then in parentheses checkout : and then whatever. And so all of a sudden that stuff is parsable. If you put feature with an exclamation point, it means it's a breaking change feature. And so then they have these like automated changelog generators that use conventional commits. And so all of a sudden it'll parse out the commit history with your conventional commits, and then automatically make the changelog, and even tell you what version the next version bump should be. Because you'll say like maybe this was version 1.1.1, and then we have like 3 features and a couple of patches that were since the next version that we're about to release. Well, it knows that it's 1.2.1 because features is the second number in semantic versioning. If somebody put in there a breaking change, then it bumps to a major version, and this lets the team know, hey, like we're breaking the contract here. Like we're expecting people to upgrade to 2.0 of this library if we actually include this, which gives a really good indicator in their code review of, do we actually need to introduce a breaking change here, right? Like that's a great topic to bring up. It's like the only way that we could implement this is that I had to break the contract, and so therefore we're version bumping. And I love that kind of feedback because there's communities that are obsessed with not making breaking changes, right? And this is a perfect example of like automation tools. Conventional commits is like a good example of like, it's something I do manually. I have to think about it, but there's a bunch of machines that can like give me extra insight. I actually built a tool. This is one of those cases. I built a custom tool called Version Bump that would go in, and it had commit privileges in the main branch, the trunk branch, and it would actually look at the latest one and then decide whether it should version bump off of conventional commits and then commit that version bump.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so, and it was always this release candidate. So it would always look at like, what's the minimum amount of version bump that I can do? But when we would go to release, nobody had to like think about like, oh, is this version 1.2.3 or 1.2.4? It was already solved for you. Like the machine automatically did this, and we did it off of conventional commits. So we would actually, if you didn't write a conventional commit formatted title or commit, it would reject. You could not merge into trunk. So like, to stick to this system, you had to we had more automations around it. And so for that team, it was an amazing feature.
No, I love it. And folks, I'm harsh on internal tooling, but there are purposes. Like Nathan said, sometimes there are things that just don't exist out there. I rag on internal tooling because I think in some ways that they're a result of incuriosity. Just because you find this problem and you're excited to build something, so you build it. I'm just saying, just be a little more curious, see if that solution exists out there, and see if you can leverage it, and then have the humility to use someone else's solution rather than building your own. But if that curiosity leads you to investigate and realize, hey, there's not something that does this, like you're talking about, Nathan, with this automatic commit that logs version bumps, by all means, go ahead and build it.
So the contrarian view would be, yeah. and this is, I've been in other organizations where, do you even need semantic versioning? Right. So that would be like the bigger like philosophical question is like, are we using this because we think that everyone should do semantic versioning? Or should we just let the commit itself be the version? Which is that's like the most radical view of like people who do continuous delivery. It's like, oh, well, the commit is the version. The commit is actually provable that the code was in a particular state at some point in time. And so some people supplement that by putting a timestamp or doing some other things. And I would encourage, like, if someone like me proposed a tool like Version Bump, which again for our use case was absolutely correct, because we had these Python SDKs that were tightly coupled with our API, and so the people would use the SDK. They needed semantic versioning, and so we would put those together. We would say, okay, this API and this SDK are part of the same thing. And it served us well for the time. But I would even push back now and say, yeah, but does the server actually need version bump? I don't know if the server needs version bump. Like you need to have automated testing that your SDK doesn't break the contract with the server, right? Which is again better because you don't have to build a custom tool.
This brings us to the Neal Ford, Mark Richards school of thought about how everything is a trade-off, right? Yep. You just got to know the benefits of the particular field you're working in. I imagine that the philosophy of, hey, the commit is the version would be a nightmare for like a mobile app, right? Because every time you submit to the App Store, you have to go through an actual like Apple review process. And so the idea that you'd be submitting to the App Store every single time a commit is made is just not feasible. So version bumping is critical there. But like you're saying, something on this, like a server running back end, is kind of just visible to you at the company. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't need versioning. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up this part of our discussion. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with our closing thoughts on the book. And we are back. Thanks for tuning in. We're just going to round out the podcast with our usual closing ceremonies. We always like to talk about, after we read a book, what are we going to do differently in our career as a result of having read this book, or at least the first half of Looks Good to Me. Nathan, what are your thoughts?
So I'm a huge fan of automation. I mean, because I'm in the DevOps SRE sort of background, we are tasked with doing a lot of these CI/CD pieces. I haven't spent as much time on PR templates and on code owner automation. We actually have some in my existing organization for some teams. I would love to generalize this and spend some time in it. It seems like such a powerful pattern of like making sure that you're assigning the right people to code reviews and making sure that the expectations of what happens in the PR is all set from a template from day one.
No, I agree. We actually are doing pretty good with automation on my team. What I took away, and we didn't talk a bit about this as much, but pair programming. She talks a bit about the philosophy of pair programming. My company really talks the talk when it comes to pair programming. It's the very first thing you do at our company is a pair programming interview. We don't even do automated assessments. We just jump straight to pair programming. It's very sanctioned by the company, top down. We even pay for like a special pair programming tool called Tuple, which is designed to provide real low latency screen control for distributed teams. And I just don't do it nearly as often as I should. And we've just formed this new team, and I'm one of the leaders on the team. And, I have it within myself to really start up a culture of pair programming. So I want to be better about that. And she talks about pair programming as another way of code review, where in some ways, each line of code is being reviewed as it's written. So I'd just like to be getting into a better pair programming culture on my team. And then we always close out the podcast with recommendations. Nathan, who would you recommend this book to?
So this is an all levels book. I don't do this for every book, but I do think that anyone who's looking to level up their review process, if you've been in high functioning code review processes in the past and you're at a new company and you're struggling to be like, what are we missing here? That's another good audience for this book. I also think this is a perfect book for junior devs, because if you're in an academic program, if you're doing a code boot camp, you aren't going to get the code review expectations knowledge. And if you got a head start, read this book. It is a very valuable thing. It's like you'll understand industry jargon, expectations, how to work as a group. And then you don't have to do trial by fire like everybody else did. So I'd say that's my input on that.
I agree. Look, if you want to know about code reviews, this is the book for you, right? There are some books we've kind of given a very general recommendation, like a philosophy of software design or clean coder. And so like, hey, if you're in the industry, you could read this and you'll enjoy it. This is like, if you just are not interested in code reviews, you're confident in your code review process, and you pick up this book, like it's all about code reviews. And so you might find it redundant or might not find it super useful. But not every book is for everyone. So I have not read many books about code reviews. This is my only one. I would go so far as to say, from our first half, and I'm sure this will hold up in the second half, this is the book on code reviews. I imagine this is the most comprehensive guide on anything and everything related to the code review process. So
I also think this is going to have a decent shelf life. It's broad enough. It reminds me of philosophy of software design in that it's really focused on sort of timeless team dynamic, structural things. And other than maybe, some of the software tools that got referenced might need to get updated in 5 years, I don't think that most of the books are going to have to get revised.
No, I don't think so either. Adrienne, if you're listening, you chose a good topic, because I agree. Yep. I think the odds that this will still be recommended 5 to 10 years from now are good. Yep. So you have the chance to get in on what might be a modern classic in the programming industry with the Manning Early Access program. And we'll have more information soon on when. I think this is releasing soon, is what Adrienne told to me. But I do not have that exact information.
Yeah.
But at any point, we'll be back next week with more Looks Good to Me by Adrienne Braganza. You can follow us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. And again, check that out. We've got a quote tweeting out every 2 hours. It's a fun way to engage the podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can find Nathan with his newsletter, Functionally Imperative. You have your YouTube channel, Nathan. And then how do people find it on LinkedIn? Because I know you publish a newsletter there. Can you search Functionally Imperative?
Yeah, if you search, functionallyimperative.com is the main source of truth. Some of that material I will signal boost onto LinkedIn. And so, that's the main thing. And I've been a little slow to have more interviews on my YouTube channel, but there's stuff in the pipeline. It's I take my time with that one. And so when they come out, they'll come out.
I've monopolized your podcasting time.
Hey, it's okay.
Here at
Actually,
Book
this has been a
Overflow.
big credibility thing for me. So now I actually have some really cool interviews under my belt because of this podcast. So I'm not worried about it. I'm having
Awesome.
fun.
Well, yeah, functionallyimperative.com. That's where you can find more of Nathan's work. Please keep tuning in. Like I said, like, subscribe, comment, and just keep being a fan. We are excited about the future of this podcast. We're excited about the present of this podcast. We are really very pleased with the growth we've seen so far. And like we've hinted at, there are some very cool things working through the pipeline. So keep tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and you have a great day, folks.
Yep.